Okay. I'm assuming everyone can see the screen.
Yes.
Okay, super. Right. So I'm here to provide some tips and tricks. I don't actually know if I have any tricks, but maybe some tips and help you think about what you're going to do when you actually get in the data and have to conduct some analyses. There's one thing I wanted to start off with that Claire mentioned that I think bears repeating is the issue about skips. And so you want to be really careful when you're using the data if you have a lot of people who are missing in it. Traditionally, most people who are asked a question answer the question. So there's very little refused or don't know options actually in the data, which is a nice feature. And some of that I think stems from our work with Gallup and some of our pre-testing. And so if you pick a variable and you run a frequency on it, you might notice that there's a lot of missing cases. That's probably because there was a skip pattern that preceded that. And just something to look out for as you move along. And just to note that for most of your analyses, you probably won't need to do some sort of multiple imputation because I think there is not a lot of missing data here. But if you want to, you're welcome to, but that's just something I wanted to point out when you're looking at the data. And so that could be important. Something that Claire has mentioned and we've referenced throughout is the idea of weighting. And of course, this is important to make sure that we use person level weights in this project and to make sure that the data are representative of a national level database. And so I think most people understand weights generally, and I as a demographer understood them. We often have oversamples of racial and ethnic minorities in projects, but this is an unusual project because we have seriously oversampled a group of individuals. So why we need to do this is because sexual minorities represent a relatively small share of the population, depending what generation you're looking at. But if you're looking at the overall population, about 7% of the population. So if we have our survey of 3,642 people, we'd have less than 300 sexual minorities in our sample. And we wouldn't want to rest all of our analyses about the health and well-being of sexual minorities on just 300 people. So we thought it was very important to oversample, and that was part of our initial grant application. And what allowed us to oversample is that the Gallup panel asks everybody about their LGBT status, their identity. They might change their identity, it might not be fixed, but we were able to select individuals to include in the survey who responded affirmatively to reporting that they were lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Now, of course, there's many other identities that would be included. And of course, we have many other identities in our survey, but that allowed us to make sure that we targeted those individuals and we were able to do selective targeted sampling on them. And so when you do that, though, your data are no longer nationally representative, and you have to apply weights to ensure they are. So the good news is we have pretty large samples when you're looking at different groups of individuals, but in order to really use the data appropriately, we highly recommend this idea of weighting. And how we weight, you might ask those of you who are thinking, well, how did you know how to weight? Because we don't really have the best data about LGBT identity in the United States. We don't have a large national survey that asks that with large sample sizes. And so that became one of the scientific developments that we had to pursue in this project. And I think Gallup, our partners at Gallup were very helpful and instructive on this front, and we've consulted with many others about this weighting issue. We have two data sources that provide information about the populations we're interested in. The American Community Survey asks about same gender and different gender couples, so we could use that as a weighting target. We also have the National Health Interview Survey that includes sexual identity. And the problem with the NHIS is it's a relatively small sample. And there's maybe in 2019, less than 400 sexual minorities in their data set. And so we needed to pair these two together in order to come up with really appropriate weights. So we first used the weights for heterosexual and non-heterosexual groups using the NIHS. And then the second stage was to use the American Community Survey. All of more information than you want to know about this is available in our methodology report. And so I highly recommend, if you're curious about this, you visit that. The variables that are often used in weighting are age, sex, or gender, race, ethnicity, and education, sometimes marital status. And we were able then to add in sexual identity using the National Health Interview Survey. So these are often reported in, often this information appears in methodology reports about what are the basis of the weights. A lot of researchers don't do a lot of research on this or evaluate the implications of using weights or not. There are researchers who advocate for not using weights because they say if you include these indicators that create the weight, you're essentially weighting the data on those characteristics. And that's a debate in the field. And I would argue if you want to make that case, you could for traditional surveys, but given our survey and the focus on the populations that we have, I would argue you shouldn't pursue that, that pathway. And if you have more questions about it, be happy to chat more. Sort of the hands-on information you need if you're using Stata is we have a variable in the file called weight main respondent. It's not very hard to find. And you would use the syntax in Stata where you use the SVY set command, and then you would include that information that's provided. I'm using my hands here to point to my screen, which isn't very helpful. But you would use that, and then you would need to use all the SVY commands throughout your analysis. So we highly suggest doing that if you're using SAS, there's a weight command. If you're using R, I'm not sure what it is, but I'm sure we could find out for you. We also have a couple weight that's called weight couple. I think we've also have a time diary weight, which I bet will be called something like weight time diary. So as we move forward, we'll keep everybody updated about that. And that's why I think it's important to, if you're using the data, to look at the webpage that we have that's hosted through the University of Minnesota for NCHAT, because that will provide any updates. We're hoping to develop a frequently asked question link on there so that as questions emerge, I'm sure if you have a question, somebody else has the same question, and we haven't anticipated that in our reports, or sometimes it's in the report, but it's buried and you can't find it, and it's not in the format, or it's not very helpful to you. So we want to make this as helpful to people as possible. So basically, that's what, when we talk about weights, that's what we are referencing. Are there any questions about weights? Let's see, I can't see my chat for some reason. No? Okay, if there are none, then I'll keep going. These are just some ideas. Claire has alluded to all of these. Sometimes it's good to hear the information again in a slightly different way, because when you're thinking about actually coding some of these identities and some of these measures, you might be, it sounds good when somebody talks about it, but then when you're actually faced with it and you're sitting in front of the computer, you realize, oh my gosh, how am I going to code some of these indicators? And so we've spent some time thinking about it so we can share with you our experiences. We don't have all of the answers, and it's really up to you as investigators to make your own decisions about this. Just because we've done it one way doesn't mean it can't be done many ways. So just starting with racial and ethnic diversity. You all heard about the select more than one race, which is a question that's very akin to what you see in the Census Bureau. We also have a question about, are you Hispanic, Latina, Latinx, Spanish or Spanish origin? Often people will combine these together into a race and ethnic category combined, not just focusing on race or ethnicity. But of course, there's many ways to use these data. And then what Claire also mentioned was the exclusive categorization versus endorsed. So many of us who are demographers are used to probably these exclusive measures because we want to include a set of dummy variables in our models that indicate what race or ethnicity you are versus other race or ethnicities. And everybody needs to fit into one spot in order for that kind of coding to work. And when they're mutually, all the categories are mutually exclusive. That might not be how you want to pursue your research. That might not be what makes sense for you, as Claire brought up, that endorsed, some people are what are essentially erased when we use these methods. And so if your focus is on a group that you feel is really important to highlight, then you might not want to pursue this option. We've, in most of our works to date, we have used a mutually exclusive categorization, and Claire has talked about the distributions. Here we provide some unweighted sample sizes, and then the weighted and unweighted percentages there on the right. And you can make your own decisions about how you would want to categorize people. A problem I have with this also is that you're sort of prioritizing one race or ethnicity over another. I don't think that's always appropriate. And what the big problem here, I would argue, is the people who are multiracial. Those folks often have more than one identity, and now they're put all together into one group. And that might just not make sense for what for the kind of project you have moving forward. So you can also, because they have the select all category, think about coding it differently, which is just who, if someone has endorsed a category. And so you can see that we, if you're interested in specific groups, for example, if you're interested in Asians, this would be an actually pretty, using the endorsed strategy might lead to a more appropriate sample size for your research question. We have one of our co-authors, Teresa Schwartz, at Minnesota, has a whole paper focusing on Asian respondents and their experiences during the pandemic. And so for her work, she was more interested in using the endorsed option rather than the exclusive option that we talked about. So just something to think about as you're moving forward in your work. A measure that we did not talk about earlier is we also have a street race measure included in the data set. So we're just introducing this. We ourselves haven't used this measure, but it's can be very important when people are thinking about visibility of one's race, how other people might perceive you. So just because you might identify as one group doesn't mean that that's how others perceive you. And so we have a couple of examples that we put forward here among people who had a street race, who among people who were non-Hispanic, non-Latino white respondents, most of them, 99%, had a street race of white, but still 2% had a Hispanic or Latina or Latinx measure, and 1% had American Indian. So these are not always the ways that other people perceive you, is how you identify yourself. And so this could be very important. It might be very important when you're studying questions related to discrimination, because this visibility might be really appropriate when you're thinking about those kinds of questions. So we suggest you to use the full range of variables that are available in the data, depending on your questions. Are there any queries on that?
There was a general question about weighting.
Oh, okay, back to weighting. Fun. Okay, yes.
So I think, are there ever cases where somebody wouldn't use weights? Any reason not to?
I can't myself think of one. I have done analyses of the whole sample. We've done analyses of certain subgroups. So for example, in Kristen's thesis, she did analysis of social support received by sexual minorities, and she still used the weights even though she was only looking at sexual minorities. So I can't really think of a reason why you wouldn't. If you're concerned about it, you might want to run your analyses weighted and unweighted and see how they compare. I always do a lot of checks in my work on those kinds of questions. I don't think the results will be too different depending on that, it just, but no, so short answer, I would always use a weight.
And then a follow-up question on subpopulation analyses, right? Are there any guidelines for folks? I know, right, for example, this data SBY command has that subpop command built in.
Yes.
Any guidance on that?
Yes, if you want to, we recommend using the subpop commands in Stata as well. So I would use the subpop. If you're a Stata user, you know what that is. If you're not, you probably don't. We should probably include a little more information about that. So I think that's a good question. But generally, I would use that, especially if you're limiting your sample. It probably won't. I think it doesn't matter hardly at all if you're just using the overall sample. But if you are using certain groups, if you're just looking at cisgender men, or if you were just studying those people who on any indicator, I would definitely use a subpop option.
I popped a quick note in the chat earlier that folks could, if they wanted sample code, they could go ahead and DM post NCHAT or email nchat@umn.edu for that sample code. And that does include sample code for applying subpopulation analyses for folks who are curious.
Yes. So we encourage you to understand and work on the code on your own, but we do have some examples that might be helpful to get you started. So sometimes that's great if you want to jump start into a project and you're just like, this is, just how does this group do it? And I might want to tweak it. So definitely.
I'll just also chime in really quickly and say that for those of you who are new to secondary data analysis, because I know we have some folks in here that have mostly just worked with their own data that they collected themselves. I always suggest to anybody getting started is start with, in whatever statistical package you're using, start with the raw data every single time you do anything. And then you create a coding file. So I forget what it's called in SPSS or Stata. It's a do file, or I don't know what it's called in R, but whatever it's called in, you do your coding. And then maybe the very first thing that you do every single time you work on your data is you run that file that creates your variables through your data. And then if you realize, like, you go under review and people don't like the way you coded race, then you can just go in and you can make some changes to that file, but you always have the raw data available to you that hasn't been touched. And that's just a good strategy, because it might seem overwhelming to think about coding race, with Wendy just talking about all the different ways you could code it. It probably seems overwhelming. But you spend one chunk of time figuring out how you want to code it. You write it all down, do all of your statements, it runs, you get variables the way that you want them to look, and then just make sure you save that, and you'll have the raw data to go back to do your checks, but then you'll have your new data. And that's the way I do it. And it just helps you kind of create that habit.
Question popped in, wondering if there's a reason why street race is masked in the data set.
I don't know the answer to that. Do you, Claire?
It's probably just to help protect people's identities, and it is in the virtual data enclave. So if you downloaded the data and you don't see it in there, it's just us trying to protect the respondents' identities. And it is in the virtual data enclave, and we're going to be talking about that after our break. And just a reminder that the virtual data enclave is free, and it's not that hard to be able to get access to those data. And I would recommend all of us use the virtual data enclave version of the data anyway.
I'm glad someone already checked, so that's great. So the next topic is sexual identity diversity, sexual diversity, and Claire has covered a lot of this already, so I don't want to repeat this too extensively, but you can have your identity with the select all option. You can then decide how you want to code individuals. You can come up with exclusive, you could say how many people are, we have done some papers where we say who's exclusively heterosexual, who's exclusively gay, lesbian, who exclusively has a gay or lesbian identity, who has a bisexual identity along with plurisexual identity, which would be queer, pansexual, or omnisexual. And then we had sort of a final category of all other identities. Those could be people who are pansexual, queer, omnisexual, who were not omnisexual, who were not selecting bisexual as their identity. You can see that there's quite a few people in that another identity. We're trying to use the word another rather than other, so we're not othering people. People who, and that's somewhat dissatisfying, and so that led us to think more about other ways of coding sexual identity. As you can see, a large share of the people who are not exclusively heterosexual are indicating another or multiple identities. And analyses that we've done show that this is much more common among younger people than older people in our data file. So I think it's something serious to consider and not just group folks together. So we're still trying to figure out how to categorize individuals, and it's somewhat uncomfortable even categorizing people into some of these groupings, but we want, I think some of the categories like queer are ignored in most of our secondary data collections that are conducted by the government or other investigators. And so I think we want to put forward some of these other identities. And so we're hopeful that that you and others will think harder about this and think about how we can move forward on generating identities and measurement of identities that make sense and are reflective of the communities that we're studying. So another concept that hasn't been discussed yet is the larger concept of sexual orientation. And so we've talked a lot about identities, but there's also, we have measures of sexual attraction and also sexual behaviors. And so the attraction measure is listed there on the left, how it romantically or sexually attracted to you or you to the following people. And then have you ever had a sexual experience with a woman? And then we have another one, have you ever had a sexual experience with a man? So we've had these measures to try to capture the full range of orientation and not just identity. And you yourself might make decisions about how you, the kinds of questions you ask depending on these. One shortcoming, I think, of the sexual experience question that has come up is that that doesn't have a time reference. So it could have been a sexual experience you had quite a long time ago and it might not be meaningful anymore. So, we acknowledge these aren't always going to be perfect for everybody's uses, but just something to think about as you conduct your work. Here's a couple of examples to just show you that Venn diagram is always used in the literature. And this is just an example of 3 aspects of sexuality. And this is focusing, these are ends based on respondents who indicated they were men. I think in this case, they were either cisgender men or trans men. And we had, 731 who indicated they were a non-heterosexual identity. So you might think that would be your sample. We have 702 who indicated they were somewhat or very much attracted to men. We have 758 respondents who said they had some sexual experience with a man. And if we think about the Venn diagram, then these are how these might group together because they're not perfectly overlapping, as you can tell by those sample sizes. It's impossible for them to be. And so we have about 683 who have a sexual identity and an attraction that might indicate indicates that they're non-heterosexual and that they're attracted to men. We have 676 who have an identity and a behavior that would match up in terms of they are not heterosexual and they've ever had a sexual experience with a man. And then the final one includes, there's only 655 who might, for some purposes, some people might say that's the group I want to focus on. So we have some people who are part of our team who are interested in men who have sex with men. And so their selection of indicators might be different than those who are focusing on other outcomes and other behaviors. So we just wanted to introduce that to the group in case that was something you were interested in. And most of our work to date has really focused on the identity measure And as you can see, that's very complicated in and of itself. And so it's one of the exciting things and probably one of the frustrating things about using these data. I think what's exciting is researchers can make a lot of decisions about the kinds of analyses they want to conduct. And then just to wrap up on gender diversity, is it okay if I go over a little bit because of our break schedule?
I think our break is at 1:10
Okay.
Central.
So
you have 13 minutes according to my time.
Yay. Okay, here it goes. So this is gender diversity is also, we've talked a lot about how gender was measured. I like to point out that I think our measure is better than that's used by many data collections that will ask about what's your gender, and then they'll include male, female, they'll include sex and biological sex instead of gender responses. And so at least for whatever it's worth, ours is internally consistent in that we're asked, our question lead is gender and our options are gender. And as Claire had mentioned before, that the people who do not identify as any of the above is an important group of people, and that the most common response in that category is non-binary, followed by gender queer and gender fluid. So I think it's a great asset here and a way for us to try to think about, in our work, we've coded a lot of projects in terms of cisgender man, cisgender woman, and then we've combined transgender and other identities together. That's not appropriate for all analyses. It's just what we've done for some other analyses. If we wanted to focus on gender, we've combined, we've coded man and trans man together as a category, women and trans women, and then had another identity as well. So there's all sorts of ways you could think about it depending on your specific approach. We also have a question that's used in a lot of surveys that we realize is somewhat flawed, as was pointed out, but what sex appears on your original birth certificate, and it's male, female, and don't know or does not apply. Sometimes these folks are coded into, some people use this as a way to code people into another identity, or to try to indicate people who might have identify as transgender. Other people disagree strongly with that approach, because if that's not, what difference does that make? That's not their identity. So those are decisions, again, that you get to make as a researcher about what path you want to go down on that. But this two-stage question is often asked in a lot of large federal data collections. And so some of our purpose here was to show that maybe, what do you gain or lose by some of those approaches. And then finally, one other is gender expression. I think this is not masked in the public data set, so someone can tell me if I'm wrong on that, but this is about masculinity and femininity. And some people have argued this might be another way of trying to capture how people are doing gender and how they identify. And what we're showing you here is not probably surprising, that people who identify as men are largely providing more masculine responses. Those of women are on the more feminine side with maybe more variation than men. And that those who are in the another gender category are mixed and falling kind of in the equally feminine and masculine. So that indicates something about that measure is really probably that another gender, who's falling into that category when we code it in this way. But of course, you could combine all of this together and make up other exciting and interesting categories that could be very important. So it's again sort of, and it's also not how you feel about yourself, it's how other people feel about you. It's another visibility question. So I just wanted to, so we didn't, I guess we could have called this street gender. I don't know why we didn't, but that's essentially it's akin to the race measure in some regards. So then our final slide is thinking about intersections. So that's something that adds another layer of complexity here, that individuals just don't possess one identity. We all know that people have multiple identities, and that just thinking that your sexual identity is critical for predicting well-being, or your racial identity is important. You know, maybe it's most likely in the real world a combination. And so we've come up with these categories and act like people are in these discrete categories, these discrete groups, when in fact they're not. And we all possess multiple identities. And we also, I wanted to point out, have questions about centrality of identity in the data set. And so we often include that in our projects, just to get at the idea that if this is a really important identity to you, it might have a larger effect on different kinds of outcomes. And so we've used that. There's different ways that you can try to intersect, interact these ideas together. Often people will try to come up with these categorizations. You can see here that it can get quite tricky, but you know, the good thing is we have a large sample. Here are some examples that I think Alex put together of groups of people that more than 100 people fall into these groups. And so if you have non-Hispanic Black men, we have 162 respondents. We have 165 women who are non-Hispanic, who would identify as non-Hispanic Black. And so you can see just different groups of people and how you might put this information together and come up with different groupings of individuals. I'd also like to point out that there's new analytic techniques as well to get at intersectionality. And some of these are, I just been reading some work by Claire Evans, and she thinks about identities in a multi-level framework, and that we have and uses a multi-level analysis tool to evaluate intersectionalities when she's looking at health inequality. And so maybe too, when you're thinking about intersectionality, it's not just simply coming up with categorizations of individuals, but maybe analytically thinking about different ways of studying intersectional identities. And I think that's why we hope that you will stay in touch with us via social media, because we're going to be sharing, and we want you to share information like that with the group, so we can all learn and do more informed research with your help as well. So we don't see this as just a one-way street, where today we're just kind of giving you a lot of information, but we're hoping that we're creating a community, and that you too will be giving us information and what you learn with the data as you move forward.